What is going on with this story? Akambi was A, and now we're trafficking. With Homa's help. Akambi's the one who both, and, his best friend's wife, and now his guilt is leading him to make terrible financial decisions. He's going bankrupt and we're supposed to save him? Why are we helping him after everything he's done? At this point, I realized I had to take a break from the story. Now let's jump back into the video. This will be a 3-part series discussing which buffs and debuffs yield the best results. And no, this won't turn your nun gal into an one-shotting machine against any boss, like you may have seen in other videos. Instead, think of it as a foundation for identifying the buffs that will best suit your character. The first pillar we're going to focus on is buffs, while the second pillar will be all about debuffs. And before you say anything, yes, I know there are flaws in focusing solely on buffs. Some buffs may work well on their own, but as soon as you add a debuff, their effectiveness crumbles and vice versa. That's why the last pillar focuses on both buffs and debuffs. This video will cover details about the Tower of Adversity. Don't worry, I'll blur out everything except the stats for those who want to avoid spoilers. And if you're only interested in the results, jump to 8 minutes and 35 seconds in. Before I jump into ranking the best buffs, let me explain why I'm using these base attack and defense values and how the tests were done. I chose 3,500 and 4,000 as my base attack because from what I've seen, that's where players on the Chinese side typically land after nearly completing their talent trees and equipping decent engravings and tarot on their gear. For base defense, I chose 1,700 to 2,500 since that's where enemy defenses in the early seasons of Tower of Adversity tend to be. Now let's talk about how the tests were conducted. I'll be performing 2 tests. The first will focus solely on using one type of buff, while the second will combine all the buffs to determine the best combinations. The evaluation for each test will include an enemy with no buffs for defense or damage reduction, an enemy with a 40% defense increase. I chose 40% because bosses in the Tower of Adversity seem to consistently have this buff, which cannot be dispelled, though I might be mistaken about the 40%, all the footage I've seen shows they consistently have that buff. An enemy with a 50% damage reduction. I picked 50% because that's the highest combination I've seen without any additional buffs. An enemy with both a 40% defense increase and 50% damage reduction. The goal is to determine whether a buff performs better or worse across different scenarios. I will only display the data collected for the base attack set at 3,500, and I'll show the data for 4,000 only if there are noticeable differences. Let's begin with the first scenario where the enemy has no defense increase or damage reduction. I'll share a table with all the results, and it will be on screen for a few seconds. After that, I'll select a percentage that closely aligns with all 4 buffs to determine which one yields the highest result. In the first row, the left side shows a 20% value, while the right side displays 40%. In the second row, the left side shows 60%, and the right side shows 80%. The blue represents attack, the orange represents damage, the gray represents ignored defense, and the yellow represents critical damage. We can see that attack only falls short against critical damage when it's at 20% while the enemy has 1,700 to 1,900 defense. However, as the percentage increases, attack consistently outperforms critical damage. Critical damage ranks just below attack, and it only loses to ignored defense when the enemy's defense is between 2,300 and 2,500. Next, we have ignored defense, which becomes more effective as the enemy's defense increases. However, it still does not provide the same result as attack, even at high defense. Finally, we have damage, which only surpasses ignored defense when the enemy's defense is between 1,700 and 1,900. Now, let's evaluate the second scenario where the enemy's defense increases by 40%. Once again, I'll share a table displaying all the results. It's clear now that attack consistently takes the top spot. Critical damage worsens significantly as the enemy's defense increases. Ignored defense quickly overtakes critical damage, while damage increase once again falls to last place. Let's now consider the third scenario where the enemy has a 50% damage reduction to see if damage increase performs better this time. I'll leave a table displaying all the results, which will be on screen for a few seconds. We find that our results are similar to those from our first scenario. While damage increase shows slight improvement, it's not as impactful as ignored defense did when the enemy defense increases by 40%. Let's now examine the last scenario where the enemy has both a 40% defense increase and a 50% damage reduction. Once again, we see results similar to those from our second scenario. From our first test we can conclude that the best buff is attack. It consistently performs well no matter the scenario. Critical damage ranks second when the enemy has no defense modifier. However, if they do, ignore defense moves up to take the second spot. Lastly, we have damage increase, which ranks last even when the enemy has damage reduction, as it barely made a noticeable difference. So why do most tier lists rank the two tarots that provide ignored defense at the bottom, while damage tarots are ranked much higher, even though we can see that ignored defense yields better results? I know why. I said I wasn't going to talk about debuffs, but the reason ignored defense is ranked lower than damage is because of debuffs. Let me show you a quick example. As you can see, the enemy's defense drops to 0 after applying all the debuffs. There's no benefit to ignoring the enemy's defense if it's already at 0. But that's on our current content. Will it be that easy to lower the enemy defense to 0 in Tower of Adversity where some bosses have an extra 40% defense increase? After doing some searching, I found someone displaying the enemy's stats. As you can see, the enemy's defense values are 1277, 1886, 908, and 1308, even after all the debuffs have been applied. This raises the question, can ignored defense truly shine in the Tower of Adversity? But perhaps I'm jumping to conclusions too quickly. Let's explore what happens when ignored defense is paired with other buffs. Let's dive into the second test, where we'll explore the best possible buff combinations. We'll start with the first scenario, where the enemy has no defense increase or damage reduction. Since there wasn't a significant difference between starting with a base attack of 3,500 and 4,000, I ran this test using only a base attack of 4,000. Now, for the buff distribution. Even means both buffs have the same percentage. For high and low, the distribution is as follows. At 30%, high gets 20% and low gets 10%. At 50%, high gets 40% and low gets 10%. At 70%, high gets 50% and low gets 20%. At 100%, high gets 70% and low gets 30%. The goal is to find which buffs work best together and which should be your top priority. Let's start with the best pair in each buff. For attack, the best pair is crit damage followed by damage and lastly, ignored defense. For crit damage, the best pair is attack, then damage and last is ignored defense. For damage, the best pair is attack followed by crit damage and finally, ignored defense. For ignored defense, the best pair is crit damage, then attack and lastly, damage. As for which buffs to prioritize, attack should be your top priority. It performs well with any other buff at a high percentage. Crit damage is generally lower priority when paired with attack or damage, but it performs better at high percentages when paired with ignored defense. Damage is most effective at high percentages when paired with crit damage or ignored defense, but it's lower priority when paired with attack. Lastly, ignored defense is consistently low priority regardless of what it's paired with. It's better to allocate higher percentages to other buffs. For all the other scenarios, the same pairings apply, so repeating the same explanation would be redundant. I'll display the results from the other scenarios on screen for a few seconds for anyone interested. The only real difference is that ignored defense improves significantly when the enemy has a 40% defense increase. In this case, you'll want to prioritize it with a higher percentage when paired with crit damage and damage, unlike before when it was always a low priority buff. As for damage increase, it does improve slightly when the enemy has damage reduction but not by much. I'll do a quick recap of the best buffs. After that, I'll share a table displaying the optimal ratios for your attack and damage to achieve the best results. Finally, I'll provide a few examples. Attack is undoubtedly the best buff. It performs consistently well, regardless of whether the enemy has high defense or damage reduction. This should be your top priority. Following attack, your next focus should be on damage. While it may not perform as well at high percentages, it remains the second best option available. After prioritizing damage, turn your attention to critical damage. Its effectiveness isn't as impactful as attack or damage, even if your build revolves around crits. You might wonder why critical damage ranks lower than damage, even though it often secured second place in the test. The explanation lies in the fact that those higher numbers were not solely attributed to the critical damage buff itself. They also depended on the critical hit buff. All the tests were conducted under the assumption of having a 100% critical hit rate, which I haven't mentioned until now. In reality, critical hit is the second best buff to prioritize if you aim to enhance your damage output. However, it's important to note that there's a risk involved. If you don't land a critical hit, that potential damage is lost. This is based on a base attack of 3,500 and 4,000. If the enemy's final defense is at 0, then your attack should be 10% higher than your damage. For example, if you have 10% damage, you would want 20% attack. If you have 20% damage, then your attack should be 30%, etc. If the enemy's final defense is at 1000, then your attack should be 20% higher than your damage. For example, if you have 10% damage, you would want 30% attack. If you have 20% damage, then your attack should be 40%, etc. If the enemy's final defense is at 2000, then your attack should be 40% higher than your damage. For example, if you have 10% damage, you would want 50% attack. If you have 20% damage, then your attack should be 60%, etc. Here are a few examples. The Resonance Sword plus Wand or Sword plus Pentacle. Which one is better? Both perform the same if there's no roll advantage or disadvantage, but if you do have, Sword plus Wand will deal 3% more damage, assuming you can move 3 tiles with each attack. Does wearing the Justice or the Emperor Tarot provide better damage output? If you have 120% damage or more, the Justice Tarot will yield better results. Otherwise, use the Emperor. But what if you're using it to replace the Magician Tarot? In that case, if you have 40% damage or more, the Justice will perform better. If not, stick with the Magician. Does that mean Justice isn't that good? Not at all. The 15% critical hit rate it provides is essential. It simply means that if your character already has a high critical hit rate, using another tarot will yield better results. Since we know that the second best buff is going for critical hit, should all DPS builds focus on a crit build? The answer is no. If you choose to take the Justice Tarot instead of the Magician, every time you miss a crit, you'll be losing around 10% damage. Essentially, you need 3 chances to land a critical hit to break even. On the other hand, if you select the Justice Tarot over the Emperor, you'll lose around 20% damage, meaning you only have 2 chances to land a critical hit to break even. If the first hit is a critical hit, you'll deal either 30% more damage or 10% more damage depending on which tarot you are replacing. In conclusion, only go for crit if you're fishing for one big hit or can reliably achieve a high critical hit rate. Thank you for watching. That's all you need to know about buffs. Hold on, wait a minute, something ain't right. Did I forget to mention another buff? The one that performs well against enemies with high defense? Ah yes, Ignored Defense. The issue with Ignored Defense is that it excels on its own but it doesn't pair well with attack. Therefore, it's best to avoid Ignored Defense entirely.